Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously fascinating story about generational craft, family expectations, and, the heavy weight of tradition. We'll be looking closely at a narrative centered around a young girl and her mother as they navigate the ancient art of pottery. Right off the bat, I want you to keep this deep, kind of philosophical question in mind. Who actually owns a traditional skill? Like, is it the artisan who literally sweats and bleeds to master it? Or is it the broader community that relies on that skill for their shared history and identity? Because honestly, this tension lies at the very heart of the text we're examining today. Section 1, A Dream of Pottery. So, to really understand this conflict, we first need to meet our protagonist. She's a young girl named Scintilla. And ever since she was old enough to follow her mother out to the fields, she harbored this singular, burning dream. She wanted to become a master potmaker, just like her mother and her grandmother right before her. Her fascination was just so incredibly strong. On the days she could stay behind in the village, Scintilla would actually secretly approach the local expert potters, basically begging to learn their skills. But, well, you know how it is when kids express these grand ambitions, right? The experts were mostly just amused. They looked at her insistence as this cute little phase, assuming her interest was nothing more than a passing fancy. The adults in her village fully expected her to just, outgrow it, meaning they thought she'd lose interest as she got older. Like any childhood hobby, they figured she'd totally forget about it once she faced the real world. But as you'll see, Scintilla's connection to the clay was far deeper than anyone realized. It definitely wasn't just a phase. Section 2, The Burden of the Craft. To get to the root of this conflict, we have to look at Scintilla's mother, Arenla. Now, Arenla is a master potter herself, but she desperately wants her daughter to walk a completely different path. She wants Scintilla to be a weaver instead. And why? Well, it really just comes down to the immense burden of the work. Scintilla actually overhears her mother speaking to her father one night, and honestly, her mother's words are absolutely crushing. Speaking with this deep fatigue and resignation, she says, "I shall not teach her pot making, as it has brought no joy to me and only a pittance for my troubles." This isn't just a mother discouraging a hobby. This is a woman deeply, deeply exhausted by a lifetime of backbreaking labor. The key here is that word, pittance, which just means a very small amount of money received as income. Arenla is driven by some pretty harsh economic realities here. She looks at the staggering amount of physical energy required to make these pots, compares it to the tiny, almost insulting amount of money she receives in return, and simply says, "No way. I am not letting my daughter suffer this." And this brilliantly illustrates the undeniable, super practical argument Arthina is making. Just think about this stark contrast for a second. Weaving is clean, it's done indoors in all seasons, it takes less time, and it yields a pretty handsome return. But pot making, it's incredibly messy. It requires hiking 16 kilometers to a riverbank, climbing down a sheer drop, and then carrying heavy loads of wet clay uphill all the way back to the village. And all for that incredibly low pay we just talked about. So through Arthina's eyes, weaving is literally the only logical choice. But, logic doesn't always dictate passion. Section 3, The Art of Shaping Clay. Let's shift our focus away from the economics for a minute and look at the actual physical labor of this vocation. The text outlines this insanely rigorous, multi-step process. First, you have to fetch the gray and red clay from 16 kilometers away. Second, you pound that stubborn clay inside bamboo cylinders just to soften it up. Third, you shape it while constantly rotating it. Fourth, you dry the pots out in the sun. And finally, you carefully fire them in a kiln on a bed of hay and bamboo. And the kicker? Knowing that one single mistake, like overfiring or underfiring them, could ruin months of hard labor. For Erin Mola, this repeated beating, this pounding of the clay, was just completely tedious. It was tiring and draining. She even mentions dropping her molds out of sheer fatigue and having to start the whole thing all over again. But for Scintilla, watching this exact same grueling process wasn't tedious at all. To her, it was utterly magical. Scintilla watched the experts intensely. She saw how deftly or skillfully they worked, pushing a hand into the softened clay, rotating it while using a spatula to perfectly shape the pot. She wasn't seeing the pain of the work at all. She was just mesmerized, watching a beautiful pot emerge from a shapeless lump of mud right in front of her eyes. Actually, the text uses some really beautiful sensory language here.
While her mother felt nothing but backaches and headaches, for Scintilla, the regular tap-tap of the spatula on the clay was quite literally music to her ears. It was this perfect rhythm that she felt deep in her bones.
Section 4. The Village Council's Warning. Now, in a tight-knit community, family choices rarely stay within the family, right? As Scintilla continued her secret visits to watch the Potters, village gossip really began to brew. And this sparked a major cultural intervention. The villagers became terrified. They were so worried that if all the pot makers followed Encrella's suit, there would soon be absolutely no expert potters left to take their place. I mean, imagine that kind of pressure, an entire village's history resting right on your family's shoulders. So Scintilla's father, Misoba, is suddenly summoned by the village elders to explain exactly why his wife is withholding this vital generational knowledge. So, the crucial point is what the elders tell him next. And I really want to slow down here for a second because this is a profound philosophical ruling. Think of it almost like the modern debate between open source knowledge versus proprietary secrets. The council tells Misoba that skills like pot-making cater to the needs of the people, and they symbolize their shared tradition and history. Therefore, the skill does not belong to the individual. An expert is fundamentally obliged to pass on their knowledge, and not just to their own children, but to anyone who wishes to learn. The craft is quite simply bigger than the craftsman. Section 5. A Place of Wonder. Now, what's really interesting about this cultural tension is how it perfectly sets up our final act. Misoba goes home and speaks with Aranella, and eventually the mother and daughter find themselves in the workshed together, on a bright, sunny day, frantically trying to prepare a large batch of pots before they lose the sunshine. Aranella, complaining of a terrible headache and backache, finally relents. She actually asks Scintilla to take over the work. And surprisingly, Scintilla steps right in and begins beating the dough in perfect, flawless coordination. But this incredible moment of triumph is immediately shattered. Overnight, a sudden and totally tragic loss strikes the family. Arnola suddenly passes away. The next morning, the entire village is in mourning. Scintilla is absolutely distraught, crying out to her mother's body, saying that the skills simply came to her. Most of the villagers are pretty confused by this, but a villager named Enola, she senses that something truly momentous has occurred. Walking back from the house, Enola notices that the door to the workshed is slightly ajar. Out of curiosity, she peeks inside, and what she sees literally stops her dead in her tracks. There, resting quietly in the shed, were two neat rows of newly made pots. They just stood side by side, and as Enola stared at them, she realized she couldn't find a single thing to tell one batch from the other. Scintilla's pots were utterly, perfectly identical to her master potter mother's. Enola stood there just trying to absorb this impossible phenomenon. I mean, Scintilla had essentially no formal training, right? Just years of quiet observation from the sidelines. Yet the pots were so masterful, so incredibly perfect that Enola was absolutely sure it was not the handiwork of one person alone. She walked away from that shed, viewing it as a true place of wonder. Which brings us right back to the village council's wisdom, and it leaves us with this final thought. If the council was right, and these ancient skills truly belong to the history and tradition of the people rather than any one individual, then who really made those pots? Was it just Scintilla's untapped natural genius? Or did the ancestors and her mother actually guide her hands in that shed? It's such a beautiful, kind of haunting testament to the power of tradition, and it's definitely something I hope you'll be thinking about long after this explainer ends.